Good evening. Welcome to the Bradford County Historical Society and our Friday Night at the Museum programming this month. And just a reminder that the museum continues to be open. Feel free to stop by Wednesday through Friday, 10 to 4, or Saturday, 10 to 2, the first Saturday of the month, 10 to 2. And our research library is open as well. I would encourage you to become a member of the Historical Society as well. We send out a magazine 4 times a year, which is now full color and glossy, for crying out loud. So we're trying to make it better. So all kinds of things going on. So become a member and or re-up, I guess. So if you can get that. Tonight we have a program titled Memory Wars, Settlers and Natives Remember Washington's Sullivan Expedition of 1779. It's nice when we have someone who did some research here that has included that in a book they've done. And so this is an example of one of those things. And so we're glad to have tonight our speaker, Andrea Lynn Smith, Professor of Anthropology at Lafayette College. She will come at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for coming today. I thought everybody would be on vacation, so this is really great to see everybody here. It's great to be back. Before I get started, can you hear me okay? That's okay like that? Okay. I'm just going to see if I can move this. Uh-oh, maybe I don't want to do that. Oh, thank you. It looks like it fits here. Yeah. Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. Yep, okay, we're all set. No, this is fine. Yep. Okay. So it's true, I did some research here, and when I was first doing the research, I was coming back and forth, and I attended a couple of these Friday Night at the Museum, and so it's really touching to be on the other end of it today. So I'll be talking about a book that I've completed from this research, and it is looking at how we remember the Revolutionary War. And so I wanted to just step back for a minute and just ask a few questions. You know, any particular period of time, we have certain stories that get retained, other stories that get neglected or forgotten, and the Revolutionary War is no different. I think about this because I was raised in a different part of the country, and so I had very different sets of dates. So what you remember about a particular event might depend on where you lived and what was happening then and there. For instance, growing up in Lexington, Massachusetts, for me, the Revolutionary War started in 1770 with the Boston Massacre. And then I was very familiar with April 19th because we had a school holiday that day. And that was really when the Revolutionary War happened. It happened in Lexington, and it started there, and that's really all I knew. So here we have some images from, you know, if you grow up in Boston, this is what you think of when you think of the Revolutionary War. If you grow up in another part of the country, you think of something completely different. So this monument, for instance, is something I saw my whole life. It's probably not familiar to many people here at all. This is the Lexington Minuteman. So that was somebody that was a statue I walked by regularly as a kid. So what I'm asking in this book and what I'm really interested in my research is the topic of collective memory and how it is that groups of people will share certain stories of the past, and it becomes a really important part of their identity. And so the collective memory of a small group of people, the collective memory of a family. I'm interested in how even within a family you have the same story understood differently by different individuals in the family. And so I'm interested in how you have a shared understanding and then also a different kind of understanding at the same time, and how that works out as people are talking with each other or living together as a family or living together in a town or living together in a nation. So you can have groups of people who have gone through the same experience, but they have very different perspectives on that common experience. And the other topic that I'm really interested in is the role of public markers. Do they really matter? And if so, how do they matter? If they don't matter, why is that the case? And so that was another question that I was asking when I was doing this research. So these are some general questions I've been interested in a long time. So what I'm going to be doing today is, first I'm going to start with the origins of the project, how it is that I started getting interested in how the Sullivan expedition or the Sullivan raids into the north were understood and commemorated on the land, by whom, when, and why. What I'll do is I'll also talk a little bit about this expedition, also known as the Indian Expedition, and then I'll give you just a little bit of the findings. I don't want to go through the whole book, that would just be deadly dull. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the interesting findings that surprised me. One, just to let you know ahead of time, is that the story told on markers and at dedication addresses in Pennsylvania is different from that told in New York. So you have people in two states talking about the same Revolutionary War expedition differently. Okay. You also have a very different perspective with very different language, different terminology, and understanding among Haudenosaunee communities. So these are communities of people used to be called the Iroquois or the Six Nations, and there are 6 nations, and several nations are in New York State today. So Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, the Mohawk, and the Cayuga and Tuscarora. So if you go to those communities, you'll have a very, very different perspective on the same Revolutionary War event. Okay, so how in the world did I get started with this? I was teaching a class called Social Memory, which is really looking at exactly what I was talking about. Groups of people remembering the past, groups of people forgetting the past. And one of the assignments was to have students go around on campus and look for markers and historical markers or place names, those kinds of things, and do a project on them. So a student came up to me and said, well, Professor, there's a marker on campus to a massacre in Wyoming. Like, why would that be here on campus? And so she didn't realize that the town of Wyoming was what the marker was talking about, and I'll show you another image of it. So there she is, and it's right in the back of a parking lot of a sorority, so it's not really it wasn't very well seen, well known. It was kind of falling into the road. And it's not a marker to anything in the state of Wyoming. The state of Wyoming is actually named after the Pennsylvania town of Wyoming as a commemorative, to kind of celebrate the Battle of Wyoming. And the Battle of Wyoming in many parts of Pennsylvania is known as the Wyoming Massacre. So what this marker says is this is the road that Sullivan marched to quell the Indian insurrection and avenge the Wyoming Massacre. And it was put up in 1900 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So I started looking into this marker, and I was already interested in how it is that dominant groups tell their story in a way that might erase the story of subordinate groups, or it might erase other stories. And so I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. This is a little bit, what is the Sullivan expedition anyway? And I wonder if there are any other markers. So little did I know that this was going to take me about 10 years to figure this out, because there are markers all over the place. So I started trying to ask, who commemorated this expedition, when, how, and why? And I started to realize that this was part of a vast, what I call commemorative project. And it had many different actors putting up markers at different times for different reasons. So I was traveling up and down from Easton, where Lafayette College is, all the way along here, spending time at historical societies, spending a lot of time in Tunkhannock, the Wyoming County Historical Society, a lot of time here, talking to people, Athens, and then the expedition went all along here, And the mission, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute, but the mission was to eradicate the Haudenosaunee villages. So it was a scorched earth mission where Sullivan's troops were burning villages and setting all the foodstuffs on fire. And so when I learned that, I thought, this is really interesting. I wonder if there are other markers, because who would want to celebrate scorched earth expedition? You know, it seemed kind of odd from that perspective. So I first called a woman at the Wyoming County Historical Society and asked, you know, have you heard of any other markers to this Sullivan expedition? And she said, oh, well, yeah, we have one right in town, and I have all the markers in Wyoming County right here on my phone. I can tell you exactly where they are. So I realized that this is not just a historical study, a study in the archives, but it was also going to require me to interview people and talk to them and see which stories they're interested in commemorating and why and how. So that's, when I had that one interaction, I realized, okay, this is going to be interesting. But I still didn't realize there is no one guidebook that has all the markers. There is no one agency in charge, because the markers were established by different chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution put up independently. Individuals put up markers on their own property. Then later on, the states got involved, but the state markers weren't always either kept up or visible. And so it took a long time. So the first thing I had to do was to develop a database of markers and drive around and try to find them. So this is just a little piece of some of that work. And then I started, you know, in Pennsylvania, here's a list. So there are 55 in Pennsylvania that I found. This is the first one to be put up, and it was established outside her summer home by an aristocratic, like a wealthy coal and railroad family's wife, like a coal baron's wife, in their summer home outside of Wilkes-Barre. So. Then the state got involved in 1929. 1929 was the year of the 150th anniversary of this expedition. And it was right after there was a lot of Revolutionary War fanfare all around. You know, the 150th anniversary in Philadelphia was a big event. And so states started to almost compete with each other to put up markers. And so Pennsylvania and New York were watching and talking with each other a lot. So this is what the Pennsylvania marker looks like. You've probably seen them. New York had a centennial event at Newtown where there was the one pitched battle, and that's sort of near Elmira, New York. So they hastily put up this monument in time for the centennial, and it fell apart in about, not too long afterwards, maybe 30 years later. So now there's another monument in its place. And then the state in 1929 put up a different kind of marker, and in New York there are 35 of these. And so what I've been working on now, just to kind of finalize, it's not in the book, but I'm working on mapping these all out so that if anybody's interested, they can find them. There's some activism in New York now where people are thinking of writing something else next to the plaques, but they don't know where they are. And so this is of service to anybody who's interested in this. So some of the little towns along the way in upstate New York have asked me if I could share this information with them. So I'm finalizing it in the next few weeks. But this shows you where, kind of roughly, where you could find historical markers that are commemorating or even celebrating this expedition. So what was it? Okay. So if you look on this early map, settlers were not supposed to cross this line after a treaty that the British established. So you can see here it says lands reserved for the Indians here. During the Revolutionary War, this was still which is, you can recognize it now as much of New York State. This was Indian territory. This is an old map, or it's trying to get across what it looked like right around, say, 1770 or something. So this land was the Haudenosaunee homelands, and the Haudenosaunee tried to remain neutral during most of the war. They were trying to stay out of it. They called it the Battle of the Brothers. They didn't want to get involved. So the British and these new people, the Patriots, they called themselves, they tried to stay out of it. But they were continuously getting caught up in the violence. And so at one point, some of the groups, the Tuscarora and the Oneida, started to assist the Patriot side a little bit, and the Seneca and the Mohawk and the Cayuga were sometimes sending warriors to assist with the British. This accelerated at a certain point in the war where the British started to realize that they were going to need to employ kind of guerrilla tactics because things were bogged down and the war was not things weren't moving in the war. And so a man named Butler had a group of Native Americans that were aligned with him, and they carried out a series of attacks. So it's kind of hard to see on here, but there was a big attack in German Flats, Cherry Valley, and also the Battle of Wyoming. And these were attacks where the British side actually had tremendous success. So the Battle of Wyoming, you could say is a battle of the Revolutionary War where there were 300 dead on one side and maybe 5 on the other side, or even less. So at that point, Congress was very concerned because it was hard to keep the troop sizes up. People wanted to stay at home to protect their land, and they ordered General Washington to come up with a plan. So he spent months organizing a plan to go right into this Haudenosaunee homeland. And he had to use a lot of spies and others to kind of get information because he didn't really know the geography that well. Here's a map from that time, and you can see the map is mostly empty, but it does say where the villages are. So this ended up being one of the largest campaigns of the Revolutionary War. Starting in June, you could say June 18th, and then going on until October 3rd. And it had over a quarter of the Continental Army. So Washington wanted battle-hardened troops in this expedition. Their orders, no, this is a little hard to read. Sullivan was the general in charge. I'm going to go ahead and then come back to this slide. Sullivan started in Easton, you can see here, and moved north. Clinton, General James Clinton, came from Conajohary and came south. They met here, and then they went around and destroyed every village that they could find, all in the Finger Lakes. At the same time, General Brodhead was carrying out the same kind of devastation in western Pennsylvania. And one of the original plans was for them to all meet and take Fort Niagara, which would have ended the war. They ended up not doing that because of different reasons. Brodhead's men didn't have any shoes, and Sullivan's men were running out of supplies and so forth. There was also a preliminary attack by Van Schaik, who attacked the Onondaga Nation, which was mostly neutral at the time, and that was seen to be a way to kind of attack at the heart of the Confederacy. This is where their central council fire was, and so it was almost like a psychological strategic attack. So the orders were pretty straightforward. The immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It'll be essential to ruin their grounds and the crops in the ground now and prevent their planting more. And then he talks about wanting to have the total ruin of their settlements. And our future security will be in the terror with which the severity of the chastisement they receive will inspire them. So it's pretty hard orders to read. You know, it's hard orders to read. So you have a massive group of people traveling across the land. So the Haudenosaunee's practice was to evacuate the villages before this enormous army came to preserve civilian life. So there were not as many people killed during, you know, man-to-man with the, you know, with the troops. So people were constantly evacuating and fleeing. And so they moved north where about 5,000 people were stationed, you know, sought shelter at Fort Niagara. By the time they got there, their food supplies were completely destroyed. They just kind of fled right in advance of the army. And so we don't know how many, but hundreds at least, maybe thousands died of starvation as a result of the elements or starvation. So the troops themselves wrote about this in their journals, saying it was very strange for them because their mission was to destroy the villages and all the corn, and they felt a little funny doing that. So they would take some of these villages would take them 3 days to destroy all the corn. So they called it a strange war on vegetables. Like they had to destroy all of the plants, all of the zucchinis, all of the watermelons. You know, that's what they were doing the whole time. Some people have written that this ended the war, but it actually didn't. And so one point to make is that after the Sullivan expedition, attacks on the frontier settlements in this area of what is now New York and also parts of Pennsylvania were more fierce. There was a fair amount of revenge. Some of the neutral Haudenosaunee decided, okay, you've done this to us, so we're going to do the same thing to you. And so one scholar recently in this, it's a really wonderful book, The Indian World of George Washington, has a chapter in which he goes through all the archives and counts up exactly how many homes and how many other, how many people were killed after the Sullivan expedition. And so he concludes that Washington's war on Iroquois homes and food generated more, not fewer, raids on American settlers. So that was one of the main goals. Congress wanted Washington to act because he wanted to protect the villages. And it actually, in some ways, didn't work out. So other people have talked about how he never, so you have one book here by Joseph Fisher, A Well-Executed Failure. He points out that Sullivan never made it to Fort Niagara, which was one of the goals. He also didn't capture that many prisoners, and so he calls it, a failure for that reason. Sullivan also had kind of a negative reputation. He was known to be a hard-drinking man and maybe kind of irascible and difficult. And so many scholars think that this wasn't really the success that sometimes you see on the markers. And so that's what the historians have been saying. So here's just a little introduction of introduction. So if you have this expedition that has this kind of difficult, it's kind of difficult to accept, and it also didn't really work really well, why were people commemorating it? Well, what's interesting is nobody commemorated it for over 100 years. First there was a centennial, and then there was a long stretch of time where people were really not thinking about it, and some scholars even called it the forgotten expedition, which is interesting. But you start to have markers like this. So this is in Athens. I'm just going to show you some images because I don't want to go on too long. Here in Towanda, and it's on the map there if you wanted to see where it is. This is one of the state markers in Tannersville. This is in Tunkhannock, so the local DAR chapter replaced the plaque in 2013. You then had roadside signs. So these stone markers soon became traffic hazards, and they were actually quite dangerous. And so both states started to put up these iron signs. And you have roads named after this particular expedition as well. In New York, the signs are almost more blunt than in Pennsylvania, because a lot of the signs in Pennsylvania talk about where the troops went, but there weren't as many villages that were the targets in Pennsylvania. And so in New York, you see signs like this: site of a village destroyed on this, here. Sometimes it will say, 1,500 peach trees destroyed on this date. So they're kind of, So what did I find when I was looking at all of these different markers? So I was reading the dedication addresses, and I was trying to see what the markers are saying. Sometimes the markers are very simple because you can only fit so many words. And so you have to see what people are talking about during the speeches, during the dedications. Well, first of all, this is called two different things in the two different states. And I already told you a little bit that there is a really different orientation in each state. Pennsylvania, it's known as the Sullivan Expedition. It says against the Iroquois. In New York, the state historian in 1929 decided to elevate James Clinton at the same level as Sullivan, even though Sullivan was his superior. And there were several other generals the same level as Clinton. But they decided to elevate Clinton on the plaques because it makes the event seem more of a New York event, because Clinton was, he was related to the first governor of New York. And so he's part of sort of New York political elite kind of thing in this elite family. So it makes it seem like a New York expedition. What I found, though, in Pennsylvania, the story told at many of these marker dedications is really in the shadow of the Wyoming battle. So this, I've already mentioned this Battle of Wyoming, July 3rd. You have plaques, and many of you gone to the Wyoming dedication? No, okay. So if you go down in Wilkes-Barre, where it's in the town of Wilkes-Barre, or like outside of it, it's the town of Wyoming, there is an event even today to commemorate this battle. And people whose ancestors died in this battle will have their names on the back of their shirts, and the children who will come will have their names on the back of their shirts. So it's kind of it almost feels like a family funeral to all of these different ancestors that died. Now it's almost 250 years ago. And so people really hold on to the story of this battle. This battle became famous in part because there were a lot of Native American actors, and that's part of the reason why it's known as a massacre. But the only people that were killed were people who were men in uniform. So they might have been killed by Native Americans, they might have been killed by British soldiers, but at the time of the battle, there was concern about Americans not decide, people not deciding which side they were going to be on. And one of the ways to encourage people to join the Patriot side would be to write really dramatic press. So the press about the Wyoming battle was incredible. People wrote about thousands of houses being set on fire with women and children screaming and dying, and just telling all sorts of fanciful tales that were published and all around the United States. So people thought that this is what had happened. And so this became an important story. But there's more to it than that. I started to notice that the earliest monuments in Pennsylvania were put up by these different chapters of the Daughter of the American Revolution. And it's all in this area here. I also started to look at their ancestors. So the DAR chapters have a patriot, the person who served in the Revolutionary War, and a lot of them had died in the Battle of Wyoming. A lot of them were from Connecticut origin. So this really kind of derailed my research for a bit because I had to get into the Yankee-Pennamite War. So this was a battle between Pennsylvania settlers that were in this area and then Connecticut Yankees, they were called, who came here, who claimed the same strip of land. So you're probably aware of this story because it also involves a lot of early settlers of Bradford County, okay? So a lot of the women who were in the DAR chapters that put up these markers had Connecticut Yankee ancestry, okay? Why is that? Because this region, a lot of the Pennamites or the Pennsylvania folks became loyalists or left. They were harassed or kicked out. And so at the time of the Battle of Wyoming, what I found is most of the men who died in the Wyoming battle were actually Connecticut Yankees. Why is that? Because the Pennsylvanians were kind of kicked out or had left, right? So this becomes a way for women who are well off, relatively more elite than the others, to kind of demonstrate their patriotism and the patriotism of their ancestors for these elite Connecticut women who are living now in the state of Pennsylvania. So in some ways, the Connecticut side kind of lost that war, but they held on to their land, and there's still a very strong Connecticut Yankee identity in parts of, around here, down in Wilkes-Barre for sure. And people at the Wyoming event that I talked about know exactly how they're related to these original Connecticut settlers, right? So when you look at the dedications of these particular markers, you find that people are talking more about the Battle of Wyoming than they're talking about the Sullivan expedition, even though it's a marker to the Sullivan expedition. So in this area, I talk about this as a kind of Pennsylvania story or narrative. The Pennsylvania Sullivan story in these areas is that you have the Battle of Wyoming or the Wyoming Massacre, and Sullivan was revenge. It was direct revenge for that massacre, and they're presented as two parts of the same story, end of story. So even when you go to a marker dedication today, you find a similar kind of focus. So Bear Creek is where there was a new, some of the old state markers lost their plaques, and I think it was in 2017, some people in the township of Bear Creek put up new markers, and the speaker spent most of his time talking about the Battle of Wyoming and the wailing and the, of the people and it just kind of accentuating the role of the Native American actors and talking about this as if it was like the Wild West, like this community that was attacked. So that was a relatively recent story. So that's what I'm arguing is going on in a lot of the areas of Pennsylvania when these markers are first going up. The Battle of Wyoming is kind of the central focus, and the Sullivan expedition is seen to be just, what else are you going to do? You have to defend your turf. So this is, again, the first one. And I talk about a kind of savagism, like this sort of accentuating the savageness of the Native Americans. And you can see that here. They're scalped, tomahawked, and speared by the Indians. So. And here, this is later on when you have the state markers going up. You still have a kind of emphasis at some of the 1929 dedications on the Wyoming battle as the reason for the Sullivan expedition. The troops were passing through here. They were on their way to New York. New York was Haudenosaunee territory. And so what you'll see is in New York is going to be a very different kind of story. So in New York, I say, it's almost a story of the settlers saying, we replaced the Native Americans on the land because of the Revolutionary War. So it's sort of defending their place on the land and talking about how Sullivan came and wiped out the Indians, and that's why we have the land. That's kind of what people are saying in New York in the 1920s and so forth. Just an aside before I get into it a little bit more, you can see the state historian, when he was trying to come up with the markers, he had all these different ideas, but he always had Sullivan and Clinton. He always wanted to elevate Clinton in his plans. And you can see Clinton's even on the left, so Clinton, Sullivan on the top of the markers. The fanfare for the 150th anniversary in New York was tremendous. There was a vast pageant. There were 35 marker dedications. There were parades. There was all sorts of fanfare. A pageant was held 3 times for 70,000 people. So the images are, it's unbelievable. So that, way bigger than the town of Elmira. People couldn't even hear what was going on. Like they had microphones, and by the time the sound came, across. So this pageant was basically trying to explain to New Yorkers that the reason why they have the land and why they're living on the land is thanks to Sullivan and Clinton. And they are celebrating this expedition and kind of celebrating the loss of Native American settlements. And there was even an attempt to bring Native Americans into the pageant and have them play roles of themselves in the pageant, and the Haudenosaunee just said, we don't want to have anything to do with this. This is so disrespectful. Like, how could you even think that we would want to play the role of, and watch our land being lost? And what really kind of gives you a sense of a different attitude of the time is the highlight of each pageant was the burning of a field of corn that was grown specifically for the pageant at the end of the pageant, as a kind of celebratory, wow, here it is. Okay. So this is what the memorials say in New York. An expedition against the hostile Indian nations which checked the aggressions of the English and the Indians on the frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania, extending westward the dominion of the United States. So there's some problems with this plaque text, and I put the problematic parts in bold. So as I've already mentioned, it didn't check the aggressions. It actually accelerated them. And extending westward the dominion, was it because of Sullivan or was it because of something else? At the end of the Revolutionary War, the Native Americans came back, Haudenosaunee came back, maybe not to every single village site, but this was still their land for the most part. The land was taken from them later by a series of treaties and other kinds of, so often fraudulent treaties carried out without the proper authorities present, with people that have been, threatened and mistreated. Often they were being threatened with being sent away. Okay. So these illegal treaties were carried out by state officials and by speculators. So state officials at the highest level. So it's actually state officials who were responsible for getting the land from the Haudenosaunee, not Sullivan and Clinton. So why would this say this? Well, this is something interesting I found out. Right before they had this big celebration, there was an amazing kind of organization of Haudenosaunee to claim land. And you can see here this headline: is white man's title to more than 6 million acres of one-time Indian land in New York State threatened? This was the result of a commission. It was a commission that was set up in New York State to kind of resolve one kind of minor land issue. But they came up with the surprising conclusion that many of these treaties were fraudulent treaties. And it's called the Everett Commission, after the man in charge. There he is. He went to every single Haudenosaunee reservation, and he did research, and he interviewed, and he did a lot of archival research. So this is the New York Times. Indians claim half of New York. This is getting a lot of press. This is getting a lot of press right before the state historian decides to celebrate the Sullivan expedition. And so when you look at a timeline, you see his report is released. Immediately, Haudenosaunee start to organize, and they file the first lawsuit against the state in 1925. Then they start to approve the Sullivan commemoration, and they're planning the monuments and everything. The suit eventually loses, but the appeals are not exhausted till 1929, while all of this fanfare is going on. So while the state historian is planning these markers, he has no idea if the Haudenosaunee are going to win this lawsuit or not. So you can see the timing is interesting. I haven't found I found some articles where people are sending articles around, like, hey, have you seen this article? But I don't have a letter where the state historian says, I want to put up the markers because I want to claim this land for New York. Like, I can never find him saying that. But when you look again at what it's saying, it extended westward the Dominion of the United States. It's sort of saying, we won this land fair and square through warfare in 1779, end of story. So when there were land claims in the 1970s in New York, some officials said, hey, I thought from the monuments, like it says, when Sullivan and Clinton came, they wiped everybody out, and now it's our land. Like, why do you have land claims now? So the monuments, even today, kind of confuse people in New York sometimes. I wanted to share a few mysteries, and then I'm going to talk about the Haudenosaunee perspective. I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions. There was a 1929 plaque, New York plaque in Elmira, that was embedded in a bridge over a creek. State officials planned to rebuild the bridge. I cannot find it. If anybody ever knows anybody in Elmira who works for Public Works, it's probably in storage somewhere. So that's one that's a mystery. That's a little bit farther afield for you. The other one that's kind of fun, and I'm trying to finalize this database. There was a memorial put up in Wilkes-Barre by the Wilkes-Barre Historical, Historical Commission, which was an organization that was only around for 4 years. So I think it was the project of just one individual, perhaps. But they decided to put up a memorial to the Sullivan expedition on an enormous block of anthracite coal, right on the River Commons, like 6,800-pound block of coal. And I would love to see a picture of that block of coal, and I would love to know what happened. 1927 it was put up. It was probably during the Depression, people probably chipped away at it. They thought, okay, this is not the brightest idea. One of the other monuments was put up right across from the house of Kirby, who started Woolworths. And he complained because he thought it was unsightly and he didn't like to see it. And so he tried to get the state to move it, and they didn't. So a lot of little stories like that in the archives that are kind of fun. So how would the Haudenosaunee view this expedition? That would be a very different perspective, right? For many Haudenosaunee, because of the Sullivan expedition, they were removed from the land and ended up in Canada. And so if you talk to Haudenosaunee youth that live in Six Nations, which is an area in Canada, and you ask about their family story, they start their story with the Sullivan expedition. They say, okay, in 1779, we were forced up this way. And they kind of know where they were from down this way. So here's a little bit of background. So here's the Confederacy. You have big stretches of land, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. And this is a map, supposedly 1600. Their territories extended far more below. And today, this is another map that shows the contemporary Haudenosaunee territories. So you have several different reserves or reservations or nation settlements. The Cayuga Nation doesn't really have a land base, but they have a little bit of a land base now. Tonawanda, Seneca, and so forth. So I didn't want to turn this into an extensive oral history project, but there's definitely room for an oral history project now. I think it should be conducted by Haudenosaunee people about their own family stories, but I did encounter some information. What I did look at, though, are Haudenosaunee cultural centers. So there are cultural centers that are run by Haudenosaunee nations in the area of New York where you have Sullivan Clinton plaques, right? So I thought, well, let's look at how the story is presented in the Haudenosaunee cultural centers. How is the story told there? So I looked at these 4 cultural centers, and I talk about each one in the book. What I find is the Sullivan story is not a central story, which is really interesting, because these cultural centers are looking at a much deeper timeline. So many towns in New York might start their history with, oh, there were some people here before, and then 1779, and then we were founded in 1805, right? So they might have the Sullivan expedition in their timeline. For Haudenosaunee, they've been here since in time immemorial. So their history may go back 10,000 years or longer. As far as they're concerned, it's since the beginning of time. So their story is going to have, their oral tradition is going to have stories from thousands and thousands of years ago. And then it's going to move up into the present. This is where they are, just so you can see. So we're down here. So there's one cultural center on the Allegheny Reservation of the Seneca Nation. There's one up here that's a state historic site, but it's Seneca run. And this is Onondaga, and this is Oneida. So I interviewed the directors, and I looked at their exhibits, and I talked to them about the importance of the Sullivan expedition. And every center director wanted to focus not just on Sullivan, but on the whole long history of their nation and the white invaders, right? Their long history interacting with the white community. And a lot of times, the first interactions, which were often very negative, were with the French, or it was with missionaries. So their story with the interactions with whites starts maybe in the 1600s, so really early on. And you have the French coming in and destroying Seneca villages. Then you have other people coming in trying to convert. Then you have Sullivan and his troops destroying towns. But after that, you have people trying to remove their land through they talk about these false treaties. Then they have, so what you find, here's one of the images. What you find is a timeline. If you look at a timeline of these cultural centers, the Sullivan expedition is just one moment in a much deeper timeline. Not only that, it has early history that talks about the doctrine of discovery, which was a papal bull that allowed people to claim land here. So they're talking about like the 15th century, right? So their time frame is, at these centers is much deeper than you might find in other historical society museums or something. That's the beginning of their story is way, way earlier on because they've been here forever. Sullivan Clinton is there. Then you might have a Treaty of Fort Stanwix, a Treaty of Canandaigua, the Supreme Court trying to use the doctrine of discovery to take Native American lands in the 19th century. You have the privatization of Native American lands. You have the time when people are trying to remove Native American Haudenosaunee from New York, which didn't work out. Then you have citizenship law, which for Haudenosaunee was imposed on them. They didn't want it necessarily. They wanted the choice. They didn't want to have it forced on them. And then they talk about thruway construction. You start if you are a non-native, like a white settler like me, going in there, you start to realize, oh, wow, I didn't really think about the thruway construction. Here I am driving up and down the New York thruway, really enjoying how I can get from place to place. Some of that land was taken from Haudenosaunee nations. And then there's the Kinzua Dam, so you have land taken from the Kinzua Dam. So it goes up into recent cases, and the timeline is kind of open-ended. Like, what are they going to do next? So you have the Sullivan-Clinton story. It's not really seen as inconsequential, but you have this sense of Haudenosaunee nations thinking about the future, thinking about protecting their community and trying to, prepare the next generation for whatever's going to happen next and to kind of hold on to what they can. I also wanted to talk about a whole different terminology. So I've been calling this the Sullivan expedition, partly so you know what I'm talking about. It was originally Washington's Indian expedition, which probably should be the name that it's given. That was originally, and people named it after Sullivan later on because he was the major general in charge. But from the perspective of Haudenosaunee, if you're living in your village and then a bunch of troops come, it's not an expedition, it's like an invasion. It's a raid. And so this was, if you wanted to see this, you could take a snapshot of this. There's a YouTube interview. So I was at a conference with this man, Jake Edwards. He's a Onondaga elder, and he gives a sort of long oral history of Sullivan expedition that's shared within his family. So he learned about it directly from his grandmother, who learned about it from her great-grandmother, who learned about her great-grandmother, and it's a fascinating discussion. And so he outlines exactly what happened when, and he talks about where it happens. He's in his house in Onondaga, because this is during the pandemic, and he's looking out the window, and he says, they hid in that, down in that valley over there. So he knows exactly where it is. And then he says, I know the hiding place, and I share it with the youth, but I'm not going to tell you because it might happen again. So that was chilling to me. So the other point is, he's saying, Onondagas were never conquered. You can't conquer a neutral nation, a peaceful nation. Those are called massacres, invasions and massacres. They were documented as battles. They called them battles. They weren't battles. We've got families sleeping comfortably and you wipe them out. You just want a battle? Come on, let's teach the truth here. So he's constantly calling this the raids. You have Haudenosaunee cultural centers talking about the starvation time. So it's a moment of time that's understood differently. And it's not talked about with military terminology. Another quote that he has that I didn't put in this slideshow is he talks about these invading forces came when we were sleeping. Soldiers, they're called. And so the way he said it, it's like soldiers, they're called. So there's a distancing from the military language and a real attempt to narrate the story from the perspective of his community. This is also captured in the name in the Seneca language for Washington, whose grandfather was called Town Destroyer, and then Washington was given that name, and then after the Sullivan expedition, he's always known as that name in the Seneca language. So this is something that a warrior corn planter from the 1790s said to Washington in a big formal meeting. When your army entered the country of the Six Nations, we called you the Town Destroyer, and to this day, when that name is heard, our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling close to the necks of their mothers. So you have, even today, a president is Town Destroyer. So this memory of the Sullivan expedition is retained in the Seneca language in a kind of a subtle way, so that the word president is translated as Town Destroyer. So Town Destroyer Biden or Town Destroyer whatever. So I think that's another way that the Sullivan story is retained in Haudenosaunee culture, but not in a kind of overt way. So it's really, but I think it's really important to know that. So I'm going to conclude now. Basically there are different versions of the past that are important to different people at different times. And the New York markers, especially, the Pennsylvania markers are often more neutral in tone because they'll say this is where a campsite was, and then the next one is where a campsite was, and then this is the next campsite. So that's what the state markers are saying. But New York, they're really claiming that this is because of Sullivan we have the land, and then you have these smaller signs. So they seem to be saying that the Haudenosaunee are no longer a threat. But another way that Haudenosaunee are responding is through artwork. And so I wanted to just end with this image, which I think is amazing. This is a quilt by a Mohawk artist, and it has Washington's orders to Sullivan on the right. It'll be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. And then it has an image of contemporary women and children planting and harvesting corn, as kind of to say, ha, you didn't succeed. We're still planting our corn. So this is a kind of the general tenor at the Haudenosaunee cultural centers. There's not a tenor of anger or like ill will. It's more like, we're still here and we're doing great. Come on in and check us out. So the cultural centers are really worth exploring, and you'll feel welcomed, and you'll also feel like, oh, there's a whole other story here and a whole other way of looking at history. Okay, so Thank you very much for coming to this talk. I wanted to leave time for questions, and I also just wanted to say that I never would have really gotten this book done if it hadn't been for Matt Carl and Denise Golden, who helped me out early on at the Bradford County Historical Society, which is really a treasure. And Matt's booklet that has markers and their locations was kind of galvanizing for me when I was starting out in like 2013. So, thank you. It's a lot of information. I may have gone through some things a little quickly. Any questions? Yeah.
Some time ago, I read something about Champlain, and so I wanted to know a little bit more about Champlain. All I knew was Lake Champlain, and then so I came to over the Bradford County Library, and they got me some books on Champlain. And in reading those, the Six Nations were quite often at war with each other.
Yeah.
I mean, there was not a Six Nation group. It was this nation and these Indians were trying to eradicate the other Indians, and it wasn't, it wasn't a group of Indians. It was me against you.
Yeah, there was a long history of conflict, and then you have this period of peace. It starts in the early 18th century, and you have the Confederacy really kind of organized and finally kind of getting it together in the 18th century. So the people talk about this long period of Pax Haudenosaunee or something, Pax Iroquois or something, because they were engaged in trade with the Dutch and the English. And so they kind of controlled their area, and the groups were not fighting as much. But you're right, before that there was a lot of conflict. Yeah, before they had that sort of settling down in this long stretch of peace. Yeah.
How come we have known it as Iroquois that the Five Nations was?
Okay, so Iroquois is a word in French, and I mean it's a French version, I think, of an Algonquin word that means something like snakes. Rattlesnake people, yeah. So it's kind of a derogatory word, but it was used for so long. So historians will still use it when they're talking about the time period when people were calling them Iroquois. But Haudenosaunee today wouldn't use that word and Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. So people lived in the Longhouse, which was the structure of their houses. And so that's pretty recent. And there's still a conference that I go to called the Conference on Iroquois Studies or something. So they're still using that term because it's mostly historians looking at the 19th century or the 18th century or something like that. But that's why. Yeah.
What would have gone into selecting where to place one of these monuments?
That's a great question. So I have a chapter about the DAR women, which is interesting. What I found is, in Wilkes-Barre, you had incredible wealth with these coal families. And so you had the DAR women trying to kind of position their families above other elite families. They're kind of trapped in this valley. They can't move further because you have these huge colliers and everything. And so they often would put them in their front yards or on their own land. But if you're going to put it on public land, you need to have, usually you would have somebody donate a piece of land and then put it on that piece of land, and then the state would kind of hold on to it.
I live across the road from the Standing Stone Monument.
Oh, yeah.
It's a state monument.
So interesting, when I was first doing this research, a lot of people who are historians who really know where the Sullivan troops went were really upset because a lot of times they just put them where they could be convenient for passerbys in cars. So sometimes they're on the wrong side of the river. Like the troops came up one side of the Susquehanna and they would put the marker on another side. So they were really thinking about drawing tourism to a region and finding a central place that was going to be visible. So oftentimes it's nowhere near where whatever the event is, that it's talking about. And that's the case even with the villages, like the village, New York village markers. They should say somewhere around here there was a village, but they say here was a village. So archaeologists have looked and not found any artifacts. So there was one put up by the Colonial Dames, which was another hereditary, patriotic organization, and it was a bridge. And they said in their dedication address, well, we have no evidence that he put a bridge here, and he did have to cross this creek. It could have been, anywhere, in this gigantic area, like 100 square miles. But here it is. And so then it was called the Sullivan Bridge, and then everybody thought that that's where they crossed. And same with the marker about the stabbed, speared, and tomahawked, that one on Laurel Run. That was the elite woman who wanted to put it near her country house. So it's on the road, right on the way to her country house. She wanted to invite other DAR women, but then the DAR women would invite some of each other, and then the Colonial Dames would invite a different group of elite women. So they had competing events up in the mountains overlooking Wilkes-Barre around the same time, like one summer, one the other summer. So they wanted something visible, it depended on the people that were establishing them. So the states tended to want to have them on thoroughfares that were easy to see, and individuals might want them. The one in Athens is in somebody's yard as well, and it was the DAR regent, the lady in charge of the DAR. So it's a way to adding value to your property if you have a historical marker right in the front. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, there are people working on that even here in this room. That is a very strong story, and I don't know if it's folklore or not. That was a story that was told by some of the Connecticut survivors of the Battle of Wyoming, and we don't have, a lot of their narratives were published much later. They're published in volumes where they're trying to get money from Congress to take care of the losses during the Wyoming battle. So it's coming out in various polemical ways. She was probably a historical figure. I'm not sure what her origins were. She may have been Shawnee. The story of knocking people's heads, that's printed, having soldiers sit around a circle and bashing their heads in. That's the story people tell. I'm not sure if that's true at all. So we don't really have strong evidence that that's true, but that's definitely part of folklore, at least, or a narrative that's told a lot in the Wilkes-Barre area. And one of the first markers that the DAR put up, the newly formed Wilkes-Barre chapter of the DAR, was a cage around Queen Esther's Rock to protect it, because it was supposedly that's where she was killing all of the men. It was so sought after, people were chipping away at it and taking souvenirs. And so they protected it with a big cage. So it was definitely a widely known story, but some people in your organization are actually working on that, so maybe they'll find out more. Some people have tried to find out where she lived and tried to do archaeological research recently, and they haven't found out conclusive information, but she is from a well-known family, we think. Yeah.
So you're saying that her rock is down in Wyoming?
Yeah.
So she traveled from Queen Esther Village to her town?
Supposedly she was, the story goes that her son was killed, and she was in such despair, and she ended up down there for some reason right before the battle, and then took part in it. But I'm not sure that, I just don't know if we know for sure. I think she was. I think her mother was French, as well, or half French. But again, I'm not sure we know exactly who Queen Esther was. Yeah. So it's kind of a fascinating story. Yeah. But yeah, at the event for the Wyoming massacre, the ceremony, July 3rd, or it's July 4th now when they do it, people will go down to her rock at the end and have a celebration there as well. So, yeah. Oh, I don't think so. I don't know anything about her death. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I don't know. So this is interesting. So maybe there'll be a talk about her next or something. Yeah, I won't do it, but I know somebody who might. Yeah. Any other questions? So I did bring books. Oh, I'll ask them. I'll just tell you, the books are expensive right now. They're $65, but I brought them. I can get them for $40, so I have them as an author discount. And I also have sheets where you can get 40% off if you just want to order it later, if you want to think about it. So I have the sheets with the discount is good anytime. Or if you're interested in buying them, I'm happy to sign them. Other questions, though?
Is there a definitive line between the Cayugas and the Senecas? Because my family was involved in the Blue Falls and the captives there, 19 or 1700 or 78. And as I've been researching, they're called as Seneca Indians, but I see a map that it's more Cayuga.
Yeah, there's a lot of intermarriage. Yeah, did you want to answer? Oh, she was wondering about the relationship between the Seneca and the Cayuga, and is there there's some overlap? Is there a definitive line between the different groups? And from what I know, especially after, well, but even before the Sullivan expedition, there was a lot of disruption in the early parts of the Revolutionary War. So you did have families moving from one area to the other. And then in the wake of the Sullivan expedition, a lot of Cayuga ended up living on Seneca land or intermarrying. And so you do have a lot of overlap and connection. Yeah. And so there are genealogists, there are Haudenosaunee genealogists in Buffalo that work on these kinds of questions because it's hard for people to sort out their family histories to figure out which nation they might have been in. And so if I could give you that name if you'd like, the people who really know all of the different families and when they move from one town to the next and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Schuler County, I was up there just recently, and they said for the big anniversary when they're planning an interpretive trail, sort of like the Washington Trail out west for his expedition that went up to Fort Louis.
Uh-huh.
And they're planning to do an interpretive trail today.
Huh. Just in the county?
Well, I guess the counties are getting all together.
Oh, interesting.
They're thinking about doing it,
Oh, that's interesting.
so.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'd like to know more about that. Yeah. What's that? Oh, he was saying that I think I might be pronounced Schuyler County, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that's right. But anyway, in one of the counties in New York, people are thinking about doing an interpretive trail about the Sullivan expedition. Yeah. Yeah, I think there is a group of people in New York who are talking about ways to respond in advance of the 250th anniversary of this event. And so some people are talking about like a peace march. Other people are talking about growing corn all along the way as a kind of art exhibit, like a living art exhibit. Other people are talking about putting up new markers or having some kind of large community event involving Haudenosaunee and non-Haudenosaunee people. So there's a lot of different ideas. Yeah. So in New York, there's a lot of concern because there are active Haudenosaunee nations that are still around. And so the story concerns them as well. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, I think I might have met you before.